Hello and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm joined today by Carrie Gress. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you on. I'm really excited for this conversation because I think it's really interesting. I love history and I love philosophy, and this kind of combines the two of them.
It's
Talking
all there
about
then. Yeah.
exactly early feminism and how the
Yeah.
feminist movements affected people. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I guess we'll just start with why did you write The End of Woman? Because you wrote the book
Mhm.
End of Woman: How Smashing the Patriarchy Has Destroyed Us.
Mhm.
And it's just from what I've heard about, I haven't actually read all of the content, but I've been trying to familiarize myself with what you've talked about. And it
Mhm.
sounds like it's really interesting the discoveries you made. So can you just what
Mhm.
like inspired you to write this book in the first place?
Yeah. Well, I wrote a previous book called The Anti-Mary Exposed that came out in, I think, 2018. And that's obviously a very Catholic book, very much focuses on the Virgin Mary and just Fatima and all kinds of things. And really looked at second wave feminism and that just the problems that have arisen from there and how we got this elite class of women and men who support them that have really changed the way in which we think about womanhood today. So that came out and really, I think so many people were really moved by it and changed by it, and just it was incredible to get emails and letters, and people really changing their lives because of it. And but in the meantime, many people said, "Can you write something that is also for Protestants or for a secular audience that isn't obviously so Catholic, because people just need to know this content. It's not specifically Catholic ideas." So that was always really in the back of my mind. But as we got closer and closer to this reality of the trans movement and how it is that we can't define what a woman is, then it suddenly became clear, like, that I had to write The End of Woman, that I needed to do it from a secular perspective, and that I could do it. And I obviously didn't want to just regurgitate everything from the Anti-Mary Exposed. I needed fresh content, and it was a different publisher and all kinds of different aspects to it. So I finally decided that I was going to just go back and look at first wave feminism as well, because I just had never really dug into it. I had always heard that it was great, and there was a lot of just incredible women and rich content and things that we could really look back to as a real authentic feminism, and that it was hijacked by the second wave. And so I just needed to go back and check it. And that was what was so overwhelming and fascinating about it, was that I was amazed at the bad stuff that I found there. I sort of was expecting to spend a couple days, find some nice quotes from women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and sort of move on. But I didn't. I had no idea that what I would find was actually a lot of the same ideas that are part of the corruption and the rot of second wave feminism. They actually go back to the very earliest stages of feminism. And just to clarify my terms too, what I mean by feminism is it's come about to be three things based on this research. The first one is this idea of restructuring society and really flattening out any kind of hierarchy. So you see this emanating out of the French Revolution. It comes from Mary Wollstonecraft. This idea that we can't have men and women have to be equal and sameness. So that's the first one. Sort of this idea of restructuring society. That's the first piece of feminism.
Mhm.
Second one is this element of the occult, which also is there from the 1810s. I think there's stuff earlier than that, but it was really these three things were articulated in the 1810s, 1820s, by Percy Shelley, actually. And then the third piece is this idea of free love, or getting rid of monogamy, getting rid of the nuclear family. Um, so that was really the three pieces that I never dreamed I would find, and yet we're just all over the movement in the
It
first
seems
wave.
like the occult is the most surprising out of those. How exactly did that tie in?
Yeah. Okay. So the occult piece was really fascinating. For this, I found a lot of research that had already been done by a man in Sweden who wrote his dissertation on this topic, really
Mhm.
on Satanism in the 1800s. And then it was published by Oxford University Press. So this isn't like slouchy research or some sort of weird, like, off-brand
Mhm.
kind of website or something that I just found. And the book is called Satanic Feminism, actually. And so it was really interesting to start digging into this man's research, and then obviously starting to, I didn't rely on that alone. I did a lot of
Mhm.
comparisons with all kinds of other books and resources that backed it up. So in any event, the Percy Shelley is the one whom I really think is the first person to kind of create this ideal of the idealized woman who doesn't need a husband, she doesn't need children, she can just sort of be her own thing. He had this character, that this woman named Sithna, that he created in one of his poems that became kind of this icon for future feminists.
Mhm.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton was one of them. But he also was very fascinated by the occult. And, his wife was Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. So this is sort of in the air, this idea of creating something out of nothing, of, cobbling things together. Electricity has just sort of been discovered. There's all kinds of different ideas that are congealing in that. And he was not a good man. He was thrown out of Oxford
Mhm.
for writing something about atheism. And then, it's just a complete cad, very much. There's just a string of broken women and dead children. I mean, this is not a good man. Um,
Mhm.
and so he was very involved in the occult. So that's where it started. He also really analyzed Genesis 3 and wanted Eve to be the heroine in it. So rather than saying Eve was tempted and fell, he, using ideas from Milton's poetry, he rewrote it and made Eve, suddenly she's this receiver of divine knowledge, or kind of this sacred wisdom, or whatever, however you want to articulate it. And that was another idea that was carried through, that you can see certainly in Elizabeth Cady Stanton later on as well. So that's a big thing. I think the other thing that we don't really think about too is just the amount of spiritualism that was going on in the United States. You've got, it's
Mhm.
post Civil War, you had 620,000 men were killed in that. You had all the, so many children did not live past the age of 2. You have all these broken people that are looking for solace, and what is providing that but this spiritualist movement that's involving,
Mhm.
knockings from tables and seances and channeling dead people. All of this is
Mhm.
just taking off. So it's really interesting. It was fascinating to look at all of these different currents and sort of see how these things kind of came together.
Now,
But it wasn't
was the
tidy. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Was what?
Was the occult actually influencing their ideas and their philosophy, or was that just something that the early feminists also happened to be involved in? Because obviously you can have
Yeah,
people, bad people doing bad things, like we're all sinful, who can
sure.
still see certain problems clearly and
Hmm.
see a way out of them. So I
Yeah,
guess like the question is like how much did it actually influence the thought and what they were actually doing? Like how much does it
yeah.
poison the philosophy of feminism and how much was it that the early feminists also happened to be involved in this very dark satanic things?
Yeah. No, I mean, Katie Stan herself, her ideas for the Seneca Falls event, convention, conference came from the Spirit Table, one of those wrapping tables that was known in New York City for, the spirit knocking, and giving messages that way. She was very anti-Christian as well. And, she's also very, she was racist. I mean, there were so many problems with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. It's sort of hard to pick out like what's really driving her here. What's the motivation? What it can be separated out. And if she were just an isolated case, you would say, okay, well, this was okay. But when you look at the 1800s, you've got a lot of concurrent things happening with women. One of them, of course, is suffrage. Women are trying to get the
Mhm.
vote. You also have temperance. The temperance movement is going on. You also have, like I mentioned, all of these men who have just died, and kind of these broken, fractured homes and families and farms and whatnot. You also have the fascination with electricity. You've got, all these things are happening. So if women are calling themselves feminists, in large respect, they're being specific about it because it's connected in a lot of ways with the spiritualism, as I mentioned, but also that sort of this free love movement that's going on. So it's kind of this twisted element that are all kind of at work. Were there women, certainly in the suffrage movement, who were promoting womanhood in an ordered way? Certainly.
Mhm.
But it's in terms of people that actually were focused on this idea of feminism the way that Katie Stan was. I think it's very hard to extract take her ideas out of her involvement in the occult, out of her involvement in the trying to get Christianity out of it. And even her book, she wrote this book called The Women's Bible, that you can still buy. And I think this is probably the biggest tell, is just how much she thought feminism had to extract itself out of the Christian ethos, out of the patriarchy, this order that God has created through Christianity, by that book.
Mhm.
Because in that book, it's sort of like the angry teenager, if you read through it, just sort of going through and criticizing any time that men are mentioned in scripture. Um, So yeah, I would be inclined to say that there's a lot of jumbled pieces there that are very hard to take out and say, um, you could just have these good ideas in isolation. I think the other thing that's hugely important is just to even see how much socialism and then, of course, later communism were really involved in this idea of stirring women up and making women angry and getting this consciousness raising. I mean, we think of we hear the word consciousness raising and we think it came from Mao's China or something. It actually comes from the 1800s, and this idea that the
Interesting.
socialists had to stir up women. So, and then the communists built on that, obviously. And I go into this very deeply in the book. But yeah, I think
Mhm.
there were some very dark forces that were working together simultaneously, and it's very hard to separate them out.
I don't think people always realize how toxic the ideas of the 1800s were. Like, it's very easy to look back
Yeah,
and idolize it and say it was
yeah.
pre-World Wars, it was the Gilded Age, there was progress,
Mhm,
and instead you have, like, if you read Margaret Sanger or you look at, like, the work
mhm,
she was doing, it was very racist, it was very eugenics. Like,
mhm.
eugenics was a common thing that people like, was a very intellectual elite thing that people were involved in,
Yeah,
and it wasn't this modern thing that originated with Hitler. Hitler was kind of the ultimate point of eugenics, and then people realized how
mhm.
bad it was, and it kind of went underground and became very different because we now have abortion for things like Down syndrome, and eugenics is still there, but more
Yeah,
undercover and more subtle. But
yeah.
just how blatant people were about thinking there was a master race in those
Mhm,
like in the intellectual circles of that time.
mhm. No, I think that's right, and I think, Sanger plays such a big role in this as well as far as I mean, the big question I think that feminism has been trying to ask almost from the very beginning is, how do we make women more like men? If you go back and read someone like Mary Wollstonecraft, I mean, she's lamenting that children are born
Mhm.
girls, and, it just really seeing that believing that men have a much better life and wishing them to be men. And that's, you can see that thread all the way through the trans movement, what we're doing, the ways in which we are neutering women. I mean, this is where Sanger's role is so vital, is how do we get rid of our fertility technologically? So that she's
Yeah.
helping to answer that question in a dramatic way.
Now, do you think that a huge part of this feminist push for trying to make women like men and seeing men as having this better life is
Mhm.
because men had kind of left their role as provider and father? Like that, in a sense, like men had failed in their duty towards their wife and to their families. And that's why women like saw them as having this better life because the men, like, I guess I've heard people say that in the garden, Eve, like Adam was supposed to be there to protect Eve, and the fact that he
Mhm.
wasn't there meant that she could be tempted by the serpent and she fell. So really he
Mhm.
kind of didn't perform his role as man, and that's why Eve fell. And do you think something
Mhm.
similar was going on with the feminist movement where sinful men had like you were saying Percy Shelley was a terrible person, that there
Mhm.
was these terrible lives that because of the
Mhm.
failures of men, women reacted to that and went extremely in the other direction?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great question in many respects. I mean, it's sort of chicken and the egg kind of question, because I think in a lot of respects it comes back to faithfulness. It comes back to, I mean, this is, and it not does not absolve women in any way. There's a lot of very broken women who are involved in this movement. And
Mhm.
I think the wrong turn really came when they thought that the better way is to get rid of the family. The better way is to get rid of monogamy. The better way is to get rid of children and childbearing. And I think that's really where yes, absolutely, it could have been, in a lot of respects, stemmed from the failures and the brokenness of men and them not acting responsibly. But then it
Mhm.
continues, broken people break other people. And this is what we
Yeah.
see in the feminist movement. There's not really a single woman that's a major player in the feminist movement that you can say, okay, didn't have major scars and drama and, issues in her life.
Mhm.
So I think that was another fascinating piece of it. Um, so yeah, but I think, at this point, it's really incumbent upon this isn't going to be a problem that men can solve. And
Mhm.
I think largely because of the fact that we've silenced men. Feminism has absolutely silenced men. They've called it kryptonite for men. They don't want to involve themselves in any kind of conversation with this. They know they won't win. They know they're going to end up paying for it one way or another. And
Mhm.
so they're just not going to do it. And I think this is one of the reasons why it's just so important that women start talking about this and women recognize the ways in which we're being manipulated by it and the way all the lies that are there, um,
Yeah.
to navigate this. But yeah, I think, this just brokenness on the human level that has obviously really perpetuated it, and then asking the wrong question so you get the wrong answer, which is our lives will be easier if we're more like men. And we if you look back at the last 50 years, you really don't see anyone promoting a healthy style of womanhood. It's all very much empowerment in a very masculine form, and even motherhood has suffered that same fate. We don't speak well of mothers or motherhood except sort of in a very generic way.
Mhm. And even you also see the effects that's happened for men, that men
Mhm.
aren't able to be that protector, provider because
Mhm.
women don't want anything to do like, secular women don't want anything to do with that because they've never seen men in that position and they're afraid of submission or, like,
Yeah.
I get that's a messy term, but basically, like, they're afraid
Mhm.
of this
Receptivity. Yeah.
authority
Right.
submit, like,
Yeah.
in a toxic way. So because they're so
Mhm.
afraid of that, they can't recognize a healthy relationship between men and women.
Yeah.
So
No,
it
I
was
think
interesting
that's
because there's a
really important.
There's a Netflix movie called Purple Hearts, which I don't it's a mixed bag, like,
Mhm.
it has Netflix agenda in it, but it was really interesting because when I first saw it, when it first came out, there was this line where basically super feminist liberal girl marries conservative Marine for convenience, like, to get medical benefits, and at one point, they're having this argument, and he said to her, "You're only a feminist because you never had a man there for you when you needed him."
Mm.
'Cause
Mhm.
she grew up without a father and all of that, and I remember sitting there being like, "Wow, Netflix, you just like,
Nailed it.
that's very true," and they actually went through and took
Mhm.
out the line. It's not in the movie anymore, but I just remember being surprised that
Wow.
in a modern movie, you could like, that they were able to get something so right, that you need to
Yeah.
have that balance together, they need to work together.
Yeah. No, and
But
undoubtedly, and I think that's the tragic thing is that you can see this is why the stirring up of the woman's heart is so toxic, because the fact that she ends up we have been framed as victims, and so we've just really absorbed that. And that's not to say
Mhm,
women haven't authentically been victimized, but the narrative is that men are the oppressors merely by being men, women are the oppressed merely by being women. This is the Marxist influence,
mhm,
and this is the fundamental problem is that we've sort of taken on this role in spades, and we're always sort of combative about it instead of recognizing like maybe there's a healthier way to approach this. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's just so important for families to witness authentic married life and having children, because
for
people
sure.
need to see it modeled to them. And we know, not just even, and this is one of the reasons why I have worked on theology of home along with my co-author Noelle Marrying, is because
Mhm.
we need to use books and other media as well to show these things. We can't just leave it to individual families. We've got to start putting it back out in the culture in healthy and beautiful ways.
And it needs to be modeled, and if people aren't growing up in a community where they're seeing it modeled in
Yeah,
other homes, then they need to see it modeled somewhere, and that's so
exactly.
important.
Yeah.
Have you
Ex-
ever, read any of Mary Harrington's works? She's like a
Yeah, I don't
she's
know her well. I certainly know she's getting a lot of attention, and I think some of her stuff is really interesting. I know she's still a Marxist, and it's a lot of the fascination is because she's this liberal that is taking on a lot of these conservative ideas and ideas that most liberals aren't embracing. And I think that that's
Mhm.
amazing and fantastic, especially her discussion about birth control and whatnot.
Yeah,
But
I was
yeah,
fascinated that she could see that birth control led to abortion because that's something that
yeah,
even, like, pro-lifers don't want to admit,
mm-mm,
and, like, people tend to
mhm,
I thought it was interesting that she took the origins of feminism back all the way to the Industrial Revolution, where she was
mhm,
basically saying that when the home was broken, when before like, pre-Industrial Revolution, men and women were contributing economically to the home, and so in a sense,
mhm,
women had this like, it was an economic team, and then
mhm,
when the Industrial Revolution came on, all of a sudden, women either had to leave the home to work or stay home with the kids, and they weren't seen as, like, an economic team anymore. It was an economic hierarchy where women were reliant
mhm,
on men to live and men were not reliant on women to survive.
mhm.
And except for obviously giving birth. But I thought
Right.
that was a really interesting that without necessarily saying it, she was coming back to the breaking up of the home, the breaking up of that family
Mhm.
originally from the Industrial Revolution, where you're not work like living and working together as a family or at labora in a sense.
Yeah.
That she said that was the origins of feminism, and I guess, in a sense, we can kind of come back to that in today's day and age because of modern technology where you have the ability to work remote, you have the ability to, in a sense, have the man and woman both be contributing economically and working together as a team to provide for their family that you might not have
Mhm.
seen in, like, the early 1800s.
Mhm. Yeah, I
Like,
don't know. I mean,
yeah.
I haven't read her carefully, and I certainly wouldn't disagree with a lot of that, but I don't think that you can say that that's really the origins. I think it's an ideology that has been really pushed on us in very stark and dramatic ways, and I think that it's benefited from it has made itself look like it's done a lot more than it has, and this is one of the ways in which feminism kind of keeps its grip on us is because of things like education and whatnot. People
Mhm.
point to those kinds of benefits that have come from feminism, but you can also look at what's happened, like the rise of the middle class, that
Mhm.
classic history answer, or even just what's happened technologically. The fact that I work now right now is probably has a lot more to do with the fact that I have a washing machine and a dishwasher, and
Yeah.
these kinds of capacities. I don't even know how to darn a sock. I mean, these are things that women just don't have to
Yeah.
do and don't spend our time on. I don't have to grow our own food. So I think that there's also this element of technology and these things. A lot of these things would have and could have happened outside of feminism, just because
Oh,
of the
yeah.
fact that there's a certain amount of wealth. And I think that that's one of the troubling aspects is to just see how much of a grip it has on us because we feel guilty. And so we don't pay attention to like
Mhm.
maybe there's some real problems with this, instead of looking behind and saying there really are problems with this. We need to stop feeling guilty and pay attention to the ways in which it's actually destroyed us culturally.
And I actually wasn't saying that those things or like, that we have this
Mhm.
technology now because of feminism. It was more
Right.
that pre-industrial revolution, she was arguing that there was, like, an
Mhm.
economic teamwork, which led to, like,
Yeah, no, I would
a
agree
better
with that.
teamwork between them, and then
Mhm.
I was just thinking about it now because of the ability like, because of the technological advances that have happened with or without feminism, we have this ability to kind of find that household again in a really
Mhm.
odd way, like, in a sense, like, making good use of technology to be able to work together as a team in a way that we didn't have before.
Yeah.
But
I don't know.
did
I mean,
you
I think there's that you can also idealize that a lot too, because
fair.
know there are plenty of husbands and wives who actually don't work well together. My husband and I joke about how if we have to do something together, it's going to be hard. We're a good team, but as long as we sort of don't have to do it together because we think so differently and whatnot. So I think
Okay.
there's a kind of a danger in idealizing that in many respects too. So um, yeah, I guess I just haven't thought through it well enough, but I think that
Mhm,
there's, thinking about even my husband goes to work every day, so it's not like he's
mhm,
home but we still work together on a lot of our projects and whatnot, but that doesn't mean that somehow I'm contributing less to it. Um,
mhm.
so yeah, I can see some of these points, but I don't know that that would be I would say that's an actual cause of feminism per se. I just haven't
Interesting.
thought through it enough.
Yeah, I was just surprised when I heard that because I'd
Mhm,
never thought about it going back that far. Like, you think, like, feminism and you think the first wave, and I never thought about the fact that perhaps they were responding to an imbalanced situation that was caused by the
mhm,
Industrial Revolution. And I know that I had a
mhm,
professor in college say that the Industrial Revolution led to the secular revolution,
mhm.
sexual revolution, and I was surprised by that, and I never fully fleshed out the philosophical reasoning behind
Um,
it. But when
yeah,
she said that, I was like, "Oh, that matches what he said," but I haven't necessarily worked through it enough either to
yeah.
explain it well.
Yeah. No,
But
I
what
think
do
there's
you
a
think
lot of pieces and I don't discount that. I just think that there's these ideological pieces that are so much stronger. The French Revolution, this is what Mary
yeah,
Wollstonecraft is responding to. She's trying to get rid of hierarchy and create sort of this utopian equality between male and female. And she's operating from a very broken point of view. She had horrible parents. She had a sister who was led to a mental breakdown because of the
mhm,
abuses of her husband. She just saw over and over again in her own life these kinds of relationships. And so, but then she ends up marrying a man named William Godwin, who was the foremost, anarchist that wanted to get rid of monogamy kind of thinker in the world, and was very influential upon Marx. So you can see how these ideas have just fomented and spread in very small ways. Again, based on kind of the broken experiences, like Wollstonecraft's idea of just it's going to just be better if we get rid of marriage. Not that she argues for this, but you can see it in her later novels, and that certainly, obviously, she's open to this idea that her husband had, even though they themselves got married. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of thorny pieces that just are hard to parse out, and that's one of the reasons what I try to do was just really pick out what are some of these philosophical main principles that you see in waves generated from the
mhm,
1800s up to today. And that was the amazing thing, is that they exist. It's not like
Yeah.
it was a trajectory that sort of moved in these opposite ways, but in fact, it was actually, there's a real pattern there.
Yeah, that the same ideas keep coming up time and
Mhm.
time again.
Yeah.
What do you think the, like, early feminists would think about today's society? Do you think that they would have thought feminism succeeded or failed, or do you think that they'd be horrified by abortions and everything that's going on now in the trans
Yeah, I
movement?
think that's a really great question. It's in many respects, it's hard to answer. I mean, obviously, I think that they would be horrified. I think anybody from the 1800s would be horrified by our abortion numbers. The fact that abortion is the biggest killer in the world, greater than all the other causes of death combined. I think those are
Mhm,
very scary things that we pay little attention to. That they would be horrified by that. I think they would be horrified by the state of motherhood, and yet that is an absolute necessity, especially when you, and we haven't talked about this, but especially when you get to the Marxist piece. I mean, you can see that in the early 1900s, the feminism and the Marxists didn't really like each other.
mhm,
The feminists thought the Marxists were too ideological, and the Marxists thought the feminists were too bourgeois. And then the Marxist women realized that there were all these agitated academic women and elite women that they could use that irritation and that irritant for their own movement as part of the revolution that they were trying to aspire for. And that's when the real connection started happening. So you've got Bella Dodd, who was this convert to Catholicism. Archbishop Fulton Sheen helped bring her into the church. But before that, she was very influential in getting communism into education in particular. But she also set up this group called the Congress for American Women. And this was a group in the 40s of women who were highly influential. You had the wife of Gumbel's department store. You had
mhm,
ex-wife of of a senator. You had all these academic women. You had Susan B. Anthony II, who was the niece of the first Susan B. Anthony. And you had Betty Friedan, who also attended it. Most
mhm,
people don't know Betty Friedan's communist sympathies went that far back to the 1940s. And this group was largely set up so that it could be an arm of communism. And eventually it was shut down by the U.S. Congress because it was totally Soviet propaganda. That was what was motivating it. Um, so it's interesting to see what Friedan and the other communist women were trying to do through feminism was to get women out of the home. There was this quote that
mhm,
was found in Friedan's notebook where she's quoting Engels and basically saying, the women will not be free until they're doing productive work outside the home. This was her whole reason for writing The Feminine Mystique. The Feminine Mystique is, she was a psychology major, and she uses all this psychology to help women think that the home is a horrible place. And she literally calls it a comfortable concentration camp, and uses all these different ways, that things like the fear of missing out, all these things that make us think that our life is really going to happen when we get outside the home and there's nothing in the home for us. So
mhm.
yeah, I think these really radical ideas would not resonate well with um, the early feminists, even though some of them were more radicalized, like Katie Stan. And a lot of that is clear in the book. There's a lot of details that obviously I can't get into here, but
Oh, yeah.
yeah, it's pretty amazing how much further things went because of the communist piece and because of that idea that
Mhm.
um, mothers didn't produce anything, and so therefore we needed to get them out of the home and find ways in which they could just really be out in the world. And again, focusing on how do we destroy the nuclear family.
Well, it is ironic too, just like in today's day and age, people are beginning to realize, I think, how much, in a sense, like economic benefit a stay-at-home mom is because you don't have to pay for
Mhm,
daycare, you don't have to
mhm,
hire someone to come clean your house and all of that. Like,
right.
even though they said, "Oh, you're not doing productive work in the home," just being able to like look at now that we've taken women out of the home, people are realizing what a benefit it is to have someone there, and like just for purely from an economic perspective, which obviously it's so
Mhm,
much more than that and so much more important than that. But
mhm,
even that piece of it, they just completely overlooked of what
yeah.
happens once you do that.
Well, the other thing that was really interesting too, though, was that significant things happen when you have two incomes, as far as like that the idea of Friedan's was that women would stop buying things somehow because all they're doing is being at home spending money. And this is actually in the book. And this is actually in Bella Dodd's work. I mean, this is why they set it up, because they were trying to starve out capitalism. But they didn't really think it through, like what happens when women have a salary also. And so we see that in terms of just our expenditures, how much our homes cost now because people are using two incomes instead of one to pay for them, pushing
Mhm.
prices up and all of those kinds of things. So yeah, there is a lot of irony there. Like it just really ended up, women have to buy a lot more clothing because they're going to work, all of it, like you were
Mhm.
mentioning, all these expenditures that they just didn't realize we're going to actually feed capitalism instead of starve it the way that they had anticipated.
Which is just so ironic. It's so that's why philosophy is so important is because you need to
Yeah.
be able to look at the, like take the thought and then say, "What are the logical consequences?" Because when you don't do
Right.
that and you just start with a thought and you're like, "This sounds good," and you go
Mhm.
with it, you end up with this, like, domino effect of problems that just get bigger and bigger down the road, and if you'd
Yeah.
realize that like, it's interesting that those seeds of, like, the second wave feminism were found in the first wave of feminism that,
Mhm.
like you were saying, free love and those ideas, and then erasing fertility to make women more like men, which we see in today's world
Mhm.
so clearly.
Mhm.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
where do you
Absolutely.
think we go from here now? Like, how do
Mhm.
we then, like, create a world that values the feminine genius and obviously where women are
Mhm.
respected, like, we are respected as people now, that whether or not
Mhm.
that was a problem that needed to be solved, we have that, women are respected as human
Mhm.
beings and as important people who have thoughts and brains and
Mhm.
all, like, minds, to quote the Little Women movie that came out a couple years ago.
Right.
But how do we help restore a world where motherhood and the feminine genius and all of that kind of are come back to that place?
Yeah.
That
No,
was a
I think
phrase.
that's a huge, huge question. I think the first thing that we have to do is really start looking at and defining what womanhood is. I think we've been able to skirt this issue significantly because it's politically expedient for people to avoid it and to avoid our fertility. But the whole last chapter of my book actually is really looks at this question of what is a woman? How do we get beyond just she's a, adult female human kind of description
Mhm.
and go into something much more compelling and beautiful. And I've had people say they actually got to this chapter and they just cried because it was just so beautiful and such a balm after hearing so much about all these awful women for so long. But I think it's
Mhm.
really hopeful when you start thinking about how do we reorient women to who they're meant to be. Where all women are meant to be mothers, whether or not we have children, we adopt children, or we are whatever we do, we're meant to be a mother, whether it's psychological or spiritual or biological.
Mhm.
That is our basic orientation as women. It's built into our bodies. Built into our souls. These things aren't separable. They're not separable. Um, so I think that that's a real key piece, and it's really compelling and beautiful when you start looking on a macro scale. Why is the church called she? There's
Mhm.
all these elements in terms of the church is a she for a reason because she nourishes, she comforts, she provides safety. It's the embrace she holds. All of these things that women do, and kind of looking at that as an icon for motherhood, and instead of seeing this as some sort of drudgery or awful thing, we need to look at it as really this is where our fulfillment is. And I think this is one of the saddest things to see is that women are not happier because of feminism. Why is that?
Mhm.
Because naturally we have taken women out of who it is that they're meant to be and made them into something that they're not. We're trying to change human nature. So if we can go back and actually work with human nature and sort through that and figure out how that is supposed to look, I think that's a great place to start. Um, as I mentioned already, I don't think that we need to wait for men to do something. I don't think that this is really their place for a lot of reasons. I think the best thing that men can do is be better men, and to love their wives and love their children and to be better fathers and husbands. Um, it's actually been really interesting. I've had a lot of men reach out to me and send me data and information that they know they can't publish themselves, but they've just been waiting for somebody that can publish these things. And a lot of really amazing research that hopefully at some point I'll be able to get to and make yet another book. Um, but it just tells me how much men are interested in this. They see the problems. They want to fix these things. They just don't know how. So I think that's another aspect is it comes back to women to really be proactive and to influence our own areas of our own spheres of interest and influence with those that we love and around us. So obviously being better women, but also trying to help women break out of this emotional lock that we have of, whether it's outrage or even kind of the fashionability that feminism has created. I mean, this is one of the themes in my book. It's just that it's a brand, and it shifts and changes throughout the generations to appeal to a new generation. So you see this, the Barbie movies, like the quintessential example of what the new branding of feminism looks like. It's not, most feminists back in the 70s and 80s hated Barbie. Well, now that women are sort of rejecting that girl boss attitude, they're making it softer, they're making it pink, they're making it pretty, appealing to a younger generation of women. But at the same time, the message is exactly the same. Men are useless. There's not a single good man in that movie. Um, Society is going to be much better ordered if women are in charge and men just have their beach to have fights on, kind of thing. Um, so it's amazing when you start looking at just how it is that they're infecting us intellectually.
Mhm.
And I think this is just another piece that's so important for us to be aware of, that
That's
this
actually
is really happening.
interesting that you brought up the Barbie movie because I actually just watched that, and I kind of had the opposite takeaway where I watched it and I looked at the Kens, and like you said, there's not a single good man in that movie. And I was just thinking, like, this is what happens when the ideal of feminism succeeds, where women do run
Yeah,
everything. You end up with this terrible quality of men, and like no one's happy. Like the
yeah,
men start being swinging, like they
yeah.
feel useless. They're taken for granted. Like
Hmm.
not that I think every guy in today's world is like that, but I was sitting there being like thinking if I were a secular person looking at today's world, I would think this is a more similar representation because we have reduced men to feeling useless in this area and feeling like they can't
Right.
speak out, taking
Yeah.
away their in the important role that they have, and then they swing back, like they can swing into that
Hmm.
toxic masculinity, which is also a problem because it's not real masculinity. It's
Yeah.
self-satisfying. And I guess I looked at it and I was like, this is what happens when feminism, quote unquote, succeeds is you end up with everyone
Mhm.
being miserable.
Yeah.
So
No, and I think that's true, but if you're someone who fundamentally thinks that women are victims and that women should control the world, that the future is
Mhm,
feminine. I mean, this has been their call from the 60s on, then
mhm.
it kind of makes sense to all of that. But yeah, I think those of us who are looking at it can see like, yeah, this is creates an absolute disaster and men are brutal. But if you've been taught your whole life that men are bad, this is just sort
Mhm.
of like something to be excited about because you're seeing it, it's this reinforcement of your own beliefs in that respect. So yeah,
I
it's
did
it's
think it was interesting that it ended with basically this idea that the Barbies and Kens needed to work together for something new, that the Barbie dominated women were in every role
yeah,
world didn't work, and then the Ken dominated taking over everything didn't work. And it
yeah.
seemed like it was more sympathetic towards this idea of a partnership. Obviously, it didn't quite make it to the point of be a mother, you're like women are called to be mothers. But
Yeah.
yeah, it was an interesting movie, and I've read an article saying like basically there's a lot of different interpretations of it, which is not good
Mhm.
storytelling, but it's very good for facilitating conversations.
Yeah. No, I think that's probably true. And I think it probably could have come off better as far as balancing out those, the male and female, if they had suggested that, what was it, city council or something, that was what the Kens were allowed to, or one of the Kens was allowed to be involved in, I mean,
Yeah.
it was such a pallid offering that it sort of felt like this is not quite any
Yeah.
kind of balance here. So,
I
yeah,
don't
no,
think it succeeded in like, I think it still had that those undertones, but
mhm,
it wasn't what I thought it was going to be, I guess is
yeah,
where I was trying to go with that, is it wasn't
yeah,
as rah-rah feminism as I was expecting it to be.
yeah,
But yeah.
yeah,
So
and I
anyway.
think it just depends on where you're coming from as far as
Mhm,
how you're gonna view it, because if you, like I said, if you really think men are bad, I mean, even the opening scene of little girls smashing the heads of dolls is sort of ominous
mhm,
and tells you a lot about just, again, that concept of motherhood and how we need to get
mhm,
women away from thinking of themselves as mothers and all of that. So yeah, I think there's a lot of threads through it, and I'm glad to hear that you could view those threads through a different light. But I worry about our own culture that is so
mhm,
emotionally driven by things, and that without the use of reason to be able to
mhm.
say and see and parse out what was actually going on there.
Yeah, that's reasonable. I like looking at secular art and seeing like where like truth still comes through because you can't tell a good
Mhm.
story based on lies. Like every good story is going to have some grain of truth in there somewhere. So if something is, and I'm not saying that necessarily was a good story. I think that
Mhm.
a story where nobody, like, everyone walks away with different ideas of what it was trying to say probably failed
Right,
somewhere along the line, but
right.
it was a very interesting take on the issue that I think has generated a lot of conversation in, like, the conservative Catholic circles, because 'cause I've heard
Mhm.
people that I respect have wildly different views of it, and
Yeah.
it's
Oh, that's
just
interesting. But
yeah.
I think you're right that there is, I mean, this is where feminism has actually been so effective, is is this kernel of truth of, women obviously need to be treated with dignity. And how
Mhm,
do we balance that out? It's just the problem really becomes when you take that to such an extreme of victimhood and endless victimhood
mhm,
too. I mean, I think it's remarkable to just see how even among Catholics, there's somehow this concern now that our capacity to vote is going to be taken away.
mhm,
So it just is one of those things where at a certain point you just have to say, we've got to start building up families and order
mhm,
and beauty again, instead of just this constant, like, putting in the hearts of women this angst and irritation, which I think is what feminism has done well for the last 100 years. And it just that's how it's succeeded so much.
Do you see any signs of hope in the secular society that people are beginning to wake up to that?
Yeah, I do a lot actually. Partially because I've had people that are not Catholic, but just still have reason intact, and I've had people that are very broken reach out to me and say, finally someone told me why I was miserable. Like,
Mhm,
I've had this life of, I've been groomed since I was 8. Just this incredible, sad stories. And so I think that there another woman who's an MD in the Northeast wrote me and said, I didn't know I needed this book until I read the line in the introduction that says women aren't happier, they're just more medicated. And she read the book in just a couple of days, and got back to me. It was kind of updating me. It was really interesting to see her responses to it. So I think that people are open to it when they see it. I think there's also these interesting trends of the trad wife and soft girl, which,
mhm,
I'm not endorsing one way or another. I think there's, going to be reactions that are over the top and unhealthy in a lot of different trends. But I think there is hope in them, in the sense that we're getting away from just that, the girl boss. I have to work. I have to be ambitious. And this is
mhm,
how what I grew up with, was this idea that we had to be completely successful. And I think people are really starting to question that and say, what is it? What is it to be a good woman,
mhm.
instead of just a successful woman? And how do I live that out? And all of that. So um, I can see that there's people are beginning to question and aren't so in
Mhm.
lockstep the way that they were maybe even 10 years ago.
Well, and it was interesting going back to Mary Harrington. I just listened to a podcast with her, which is why I brought it up.
Mhm.
But she was talking about how motherhood, I think it was called like Motherhood Nuked My Feminism or something like that, was some book she
Mhm.
wrote. And she was
Oh,
giving a
yeah.
recap.
Right.
But basically, she was saying that motherhood, like, gets, like, digs out feminist and liberal, like, ideology, and that the feminist liberal ideology is that you are an entity and you form yourself and you are isolated and you shouldn't depend on people and, like, you create your own who you
Right.
are, in a
Yeah.
sense. It's very individualistic, and she was saying that
Mhm.
motherhood is when she realized that wasn't true. When she had a child, she realized that this other child, like, she was growing inside me, and she was not my body, she was someone entirely
Mhm.
separate, and when
Mhm.
she had this little helpless being who had to depend on her, that was when she realized that we are not individualistic.
Yeah.
People do rely on us, and we need to be part of this network, and the relationships are important, and
Mhm.
like, and I just thought that was a really interesting point that, in a sense, bringing back motherhood, helping people recognize the beauty of that could be the key, one of the keys to being able to kind of lead our country and our world and
Yeah.
this society out of this individualistic liberal idea and into a world where we value our relationships to each other.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And I think that's exactly right. That restoring this concept of motherhood. And even Abigail Favale, who's now at Notre Dame, she's
Mhm,
talks about that as well, as far as she had a husband and a son, and she was this radical feminist. How did she justify this love that she had for them? And that was really what started her on a different path. So it's interesting to see what leads women out of it. I know also there's the work of Erica Commissar, who is a psychoanalyst who has done all this work on children, and her focus on the fact that we've really lost this instinct to have empathy for our children. And I think that that's one of the things that feminism has sort of pushed out of us, is through this idea of being a radical individual. And therefore, when we have children, sort of checking a box, but it's also just another person that's competing for our time and attention, and making things really, really challenging. And her point is just that this doesn't stay in this generation. It goes, this dynamism, this brokenness, continues. And a lot of
Yeah.
women start dealing with it, when they have their own children and realize that they never had the proper attachment with their own mother. So anyway, it brings up all kinds of issues, I think, in women. And, this is one of the reasons why it's challenging, because people are broken, and we have to recognize that, and recognize that the culture has done this to them, that it
Mhm.
wasn't, a lot of this isn't our fault. And as a result, we don't want to keep perpetuating this and handing this down to the next generation, but at a certain point say, this brokenness needs to stop here, and we're going to restore what is authentically true and good about motherhood, as well as fatherhood. I think both are
Mhm.
really vital and essential for reordering the culture and restoring it to something that's healthy again.
In a sense, recognizing victimhood in that we didn't ask for this culture, it was imposed on us by these
Yeah.
ideals that have been
Yeah.
perpetuated, but not using that victimhood to justify bad behavior, justify carrying it forward, but
Mhm.
using that to recognize here's the weaknesses, and
Yeah.
this is like the places that I need to strengthen so I can move forward and make it better for
Yeah.
myself and my family going forward.
That's exactly right. And that's been one of the things that has most surprised me, that I didn't really expect to find in the work that I'm doing, is how much men can feel compassion towards women when they start thinking of it in those terms, that this wasn't something women
Mhm.
have chosen. This bitterness that a lot of men have, I think, towards women, just kind of melts away when they realize women didn't choose this. This was something that has
Mhm.
been pushed upon us by the elite in our culture. And, it's our responsibility and men's responsibility to be compassionate and to help us out of it, instead of, creating more bitterness because of it.
Yeah, definitely. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners before we wrap up for today?
I don't think so. I think we covered a lot. So
Yeah, we did. This was a
yeah,
good conversation. Yeah.
yeah. Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for being on the podcast. I'll link in the bio your website and theology of home and all that. I get those emails every morning, by the way. They're great.
Oh, that's great. Good. Good, good.
So,
Yes.
yeah,
Doing our best to help women just to understand what it means to be a woman, and live in the midst of this toxic culture, and come out, our husbands, family, children, all of that, in a healthy way.
exactly. Thank you. And
Thank
to
you.
all of our listeners, please like, follow, and subscribe. Check out the new ebooks we have coming out. Leave us a 5-star review and keep on living the culture of life. God bless.